Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the California Consultation Series hosted by Circular Action Alliance, or CAA. My name is Frances Oni, and I will be moderating today's webinar. First, let's review today's agenda. Next slide, Igor, please. We will introduce our panelists, then we'll give an overview of CAA and SB 54. Next, we'll have a presentation on cost collection reimbursement analysis, followed by a Q&A period. We'll finish off today's webinar by reviewing important next steps. With that, let's meet today's panelist. Emily Coven is CAA's California Executive Director. Igor Chugol is Director of Strategic Projects and Program Planning. Susan Robinson is a Technical Advisor. Dave Youssef is a Program and Policy Advisor. And Francis Veilleux is Recycling Operations Manager. I want to highlight a few important reminders. Next slide, please. Today's presentation is intended for informational purposes only. CAA is not a law firm and does not provide legal advice. If you need legal guidance, please consult with your own counsel. Next slide. We want to underscore our commitment to compliance with federal and state antitrust laws. As participants, we need to avoid discussions around pricing, market allocation, or other topics that could create even the appearance of anti-competitive behavior. A few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded, and both the recording and the slide deck will be available on CAA's California Consultation webpage. After today's webinar, you'll also receive a link to a questionnaire. We encourage you to complete it within 30 days, as your input is essential to shaping a practical and effective program plan. Please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions, and we'll address as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion of the webinar. All participants will remain muted throughout this session. CAA provides updates on program plan development at the Producer Responsibility Advisory Board meetings, which anyone can attend by registering on CalRecycle's website. We encourage you to register and attend the remainder of CAA's California Consultation Series webinars. You can find the link to register by clicking the link in the chat. Now I'd like to hand it over to Emily Coben, CAA's California Executive Director.
Thank you, Frances. So before we get into the actual content of the webinar, just for those of you who are not familiar with CAA, I'm going to give you just a quick overview of kind of what our role is in SB 54 and what we're aiming towards here. So next slide, Igor. So CAA is the paper and packaging producer responsibility organization that is working in California as well as several other states. We are a nonprofit, and we were founded by some major producers because the way that these EPR laws work is that the producers are responsible for implementing the plan and for compliance, and it's kind of self-organized to do it. So you can see the logos of the founding members of CAA. Next slide, please. CAA is active across the country. We're a remote organization, so we have employees all over the country. And the states that you see in dark blue here are the states where we are active as the Producer Responsibility Organization, or you may hear the term PRO. Oregon was the first state in the nation to go live with the program, and they're the only ones that are currently actually up and running with a live program. Colorado is the second one, not far behind. They should be up and running soon. And California is the third state with packaging EPR, soon to be followed by Minnesota, Maryland, Washington, and then it's in the works in some of these other states that you see in these other colors. So one of the great things about CAA is that we are able to learn from these other states. So I am the California Executive Director, and I have a counterpart in Oregon and a counterpart in Colorado, and we can all kind of learn from what's happening there so that we're not necessarily reinventing the wheel in California. We also have a number of team members who you all may have seen in the past or heard from Canada, because Canada is quite far ahead of the United States in packaging EPR. And so a lot of people who have a lot of experience working in those programs are now part of CAA. In terms of what a producer responsibility organization actually is, we do a lot of things. We kind of sit at the middle of a whole bunch of different interest holders. And so I'll just go through quickly some of the things that we do. Up at the top of the clock here, we always start with consultation, and that's what's happening today and throughout the coming months, which is as we're figuring out what we're going to do, we engage with pretty much everybody who will possibly talk to us and let us know what they think, and to make sure that all of the needs of all the communities and all the interest holders are met by the plan. We are developing a plan. That's a big part of what we're doing right now. So the plan will basically say this is everything that we're going to do to make sure that SB 54 is fully, completely, and successfully implemented. And that is something that we'll submit to the SB 54 Advisory Board and by extension, CalRecycle by June 15th of 2026. Once that plan is approved and we get up and running, we start collecting fees from producers, and the producer, those funds, and then we work with the producers to ensure they're compliant. A lot of that for them is packaging design changes. So in California, we have aggressive source reduction targets where they have to use less plastic in their packaging in the first place. And then a lot of the funds that we collect then turn around and go back to investing in the recycling infrastructure, which is what Susan and Igor will be talking about a lot today, and Dave, sorry. And then we also will use that funding to educate the public so that people know how to participate in this new system. Next slide. One thing I want to make a quick point about here is the difference between CAA and CalRecycle in terms of our roles in SB 54. So CAA's primary role is planning and implementation. So this is the planning phase we're in right now. And then once the program goes live, hopefully in early 2027, we will be implementing the plan. CalRecycle's role, totally different. They are regulatory. And so they'll be working on finalizing the regulations. And then once we're up and running, they will be overseeing us. They are keeping watch on us to make sure that we are doing what we say we're going to do and what we have to do by law. Not on this slide, but I also want to mention as well, there is as part of this law, you may have heard, a $500 pollution mitigation fund. That is administered by the state of California, and that'll be administered by a bunch of different agencies. CalRecycle may be one of them, but that's sort of that's a statewide thing. So just putting this up here because, as we start engaging more, want to make sure that you all are clear when you come to CAA, what sort of questions and issues versus when you might want to go to CalRecycle for your questions and issues for them. Next slide. So overarching, if you're not already familiar, the big audacious goals of SB 54 are to reduce single-use plastic by 25%, and then 10% of that has to come from either reuse and refill or elimination, and to recycle 65% of single-use plastic. So that second goal is a lot of what we'll be talking about today, because that's really where the collection comes in. And then another goal that's really sits squarely on each individual producer is to ensure that by 2030, 100% of their packaging is recyclable or compostable. There are some interim goals in the meantime in 2027, 28, and 2030, but ultimately this is where we're heading with all of this. Next slide. So today, the reason why we really, really want your participation, both asking questions today and especially filling out the questionnaires afterwards, is what we're doing is really complicated and really hard, and we need lots of great ideas. So to go into this program plan, that's sort of my visual here is like we want your ideas to be incorporated into this program plan. That said, we have constraints. And so I think it's helpful for you to be aware of the constraints as you're sending in your thoughts and ideas. At the top there, we have legal regulatory constraints. Everything we have to do has to be within the laws of SB 54. We have time constraints. There's some great ideas that would take 20 years to implement. We have 5 or 6. We have to do things fast. We have to figure out how to change the system faster than has traditionally been done. We have financial constraints. The producers will be paying significant fees, but not infinite fees. So we have to figure out the smartest way to spend that money. And then probably the biggest constraint we have right now is uncertainty. We're trying to figure out how to make a great plan without final regulations and with a lot of other things kind of unknown about the system. So, within those bounds, we're still trying to come up with great ideas, an innovative system. And then next slide. And then to that point, this has really never been done before. We are breaking ground here in California. There are programs around the world, around the country, but nothing has been done on the scale that we're looking to do it in California. By the time this is implemented, this will be the single biggest packaging EPR program on the planet. It has the most aggressive targets, and it will just have enormous impact. So not only here for the 40 million people who live in California, but I keep hearing like all eyes are on California. The world is watching California. So a lot of places are looking to see how this goes. And so I feel like we have an extra duty to really, really do this well in California, because we could potentially have so much more of an impact than just just within the borders of our state. So please, please, please fill out the questionnaire, send us your thoughts, be part of the process, make sure that the plan that we come up with is actually going to address your needs so that it's successful once we get up and running. It's super, super important. We'll ask you again at the end, but please participate. And thank you for being here. So with that, I'll hand it over to, I think, Igor.
That's right. Thank you, Emily. And thanks everybody for joining us. It's great to see that so many of you could attend. Today's discussion really centers on California's CAA collection cost reimbursement analysis, which is resulting from the introduction of SB 54 draft regulation. Our goal here is to walk you through how CAA will support local governments and service providers through funding of new and additional recycling costs. This is about ensuring fair, transparent, and data-driven payments as we expand recycling access and compliance across the state. Ultimately, SB 54 provides the structure and funding to build on what's already a strong recycling foundation without shifting the costs or new costs to customers and local agencies. Now, if we move to the CAA's approach to funding new and additional costs slide, you'll see it noted that California's recycling system has been decades in the making. Local governments and service providers and haulers have built one of the most advanced infrastructures in the nation, and SB 54 recognizes and protects that foundation. It doesn't replace it. And that's really important. Instead, what it does, it builds upon existing franchises and infrastructures, providing funding for new investments that help meet the Act's ambitious goals. The big takeaway here is that SB 54 strengthens what's already working while ensuring that the future growth doesn't come at the expense of the ratepayers. On this next slide, we're focusing on funding and covered costs. In other words, what's really eligible for reimbursement. The program covers new and additional costs for residential and commercial collection and local education and outreach funding. These costs are essential to scaling recycling access statewide. I'll also point out that the CAA is hosting a series of related webinars, including the methodology webinar held on October 14th, the MERV funding webinar on October 21st, and education and outreach on October 23rd, so that each funding area gets a deeper dive. Let's turn to regulatory requirements now. Under SB 54, the pro or independent producer is responsible for identifying and funding eligible covered costs. To qualify, those costs must meet 3 tests. First, They must exist only because of SB 54, which means that they would not have occurred otherwise had it not been for SB 54, regardless of whether they are new, additional, or increased costs. Second, they have to have happened on or after January 1st, 2023. And third, they must be assessed and approved for funding, either partial or full, by the PRO. What this ensures is that accountability, and it prevents overlap with pre-existing local obligations. Eligible costs can come from local jurisdictions, recycling service providers, alternative collection systems, or other applicants that contribute to SB 54's implementation. Together, this creates a consistent framework for determining fair reimbursement across the state. Next, we'll look at funding for covered materials. Here, CalRecycle's covered material category, or CMC, list is the foundation. Materials on this list are considered recyclable if they meet the 60% rule. What that means is that at least 60% of California's population must have collection access. 60% of major transfer or recycling facilities must process the material, and 60% of counties must include it. Once a material meets these thresholds, local programs are required to include it. CAA will be working with jurisdictions to help fill any gaps, whatever those are and wherever they exist, so that all recyclable materials meeting this criteria are collected statewide. For reference, at the bottom of this slide, you'll see the statute and the draft regulation excerpt included. Let's now switch to the funding process. On the funding process front, you'll see how we are approaching applications and approvals. The goal here is a process that's simple, thorough, and timely. Applicants will use an online portal to submit funding requests starting in early 2026. Though disbursements will begin once the program officially launches in 2027 after the approval of the program plan. The objective here is to gather clear and complete information so that we at CAA can determine eligibility efficiently, effectively, and equitably. Let's walk through the application and funding methodology here. There are 5 main steps. Step 1, applicants must submit their funding requests. Step 2, CAA reviews them against the covered cost criteria. Step 3, CAA collaborates with the applicant to verify information and make a covered cost determination. Step 4, agreements and contracts are signed to formalize reporting and performance obligations. And finally, step 5, payments are issued according to contract terms. Payments will cover validated capital, operating, administrative, and public education costs, ensuring that each funding dollar is traceable to a real measurable outcome. One item I'd like to note here that is not on this slide is that once this process commences and the determinations are made relating to reimbursement and payments, CAA will communicate those determinations to all parties involved, starting with jurisdictions, to ensure visibility and transparency in line with the regulation. On this next slide, you see the covered cost categories. These include a range of eligible investments, from curbside collection expansion and residential drop-off programs to transportation funding and infrastructure improvements. Reimbursable costs can be capital, like vehicles, containers, and facilities, or they can be operational, such as labor, maintenance, and fuel. Administrative and public education expenses can also qualify if they directly support SB 54 objectives. The emphasis here is flexibility. Funding is available to strengthen local systems in a way that meets each community's needs, while at the same time driving the recycling system forward and satisfying regulatory requirements. The next couple slides provide some examples of covered costs. On this slide, for capital expenses, think collection containers, recycling trucks, or facility upgrades. On the operating side, we're talking about staffing, vehicle maintenance, licensing, and insurance, among others. For transfer and transport facilities, eligible costs include labor, site operations, building maintenance, utilities, and fuel. The goal is to cover the full range of reasonable costs associated with new or expanded recycling activities driven by SB 54 requirements. These tables will be expanded a little bit more in the upcoming MRF cost webinar, which we are hosting on October 21st. Moving on to covered cost determination. This is where data really comes into play. Earlier this year, CAA began developing a 2022 baseline cost for recycling across California. Through surveys and interviews, we aim to establish what normal costs look like before SB 54 took effect. This baseline will allow us to clearly identify what incremental costs are new or additional and directly attributable to the Act. It also helps budget for and forecast future investments needed to reach compliance and performance goals by the time the program starts in 2027. On this next slide, we have the collection cost approach overview. To build a credible model, CAA surveyed 167 jurisdictions, chosen to represent diverse population sizes, regions, and collection types. More than 450 communications and over 90 surveys informed the model. We examined route density, labor costs, materials collected, and frequency of service to understand what drives real-world costs. This model then allows us to assign a unique cost profile to every jurisdiction, ensuring funding is both equitable and data-driven. What you see here at the bottom right, I just want to point to that table, is a view of the representativeness of the survey in the context of different regions in the state of California and the relative proportions of the population. What you'll see is that coastal and SoCal and Bay Area regions are quite represented with the survey. We do recognize that the initial sampling does lean more heavily on denser urban communities, which means that those results alone do not fully capture the cost realities in less dense, unincorporated, or geographically isolated jurisdictions. So in order to address this, we plan to ensure that the estimates are representative by doing the following. We're segmenting communities into groups. For example, dense urban, suburban, rural, remote, unincorporated, and applying cost factors and criteria specific to each type of community. We're also looking at scaling and weighting, which means the cost drivers such as route density, transfer, and hold distances, also landfill or processing access and labor availability, and subscription type service will be weighted differently depending on community characteristics. Where possible, we're engaging in supplemental data collection, which means we'll incorporate cost inputs from rural and unincorporated areas that were provided, including case studies or proxy data from comparable communities, and also the information that is available through public resource requests. Finally, we'll run scenarios as part of the sensitivity analysis to account for high cost variables like long-haul transport, for example, or lower participation rates that you may see in some areas, some rural areas, to make sure that estimates do not understate those rural realities. We do plan to discuss this criteria for estimates and results with service providers for each area to get their feedback at some point over the next couple of months. Of course, if the actual cost data is provided for any of the rural entities or any entity or any community for that matter, that will become the primary consideration for reimbursement. This holds for every jurisdiction, every entity, and every project. Here's a quick snapshot of the approach that we took to collect the data. What you see here are screenshots of the survey and the cost data table that were issued to jurisdictions to collect the information related to cost of collection service. The survey focuses on questions related to type of service, type of payment, and rates for service at a minimum. And the data collection form on the right really focuses on the components of the P&L and operational KPIs of the collection process within a jurisdiction. These two forms are essential to data collection, and they represent inputs to the modeling exercise. As we look at collection cost modeling and some of the preliminary results, the focus shifts on how do we interpret this data. And the model incorporates the factors like labor, fuel, collection type, distance to facilities, and even local policies such as volume-based trash rates. Preliminary modeling shows that the average monthly recycling collection costs range anywhere between $9 and $13 per household, depending on population density and labor type or rates. As we add more data to this data set, these numbers will continue to be refined and become even more representative of the statewide conditions, which will allow us to complete a more accurate and precise assessment of funding applications. With respect to project progress, we have built an initial model of collection costs to estimate specific jurisdictional costs across the state. This was done using key criteria that I outlined in the previous slides. This model will be leveraged to assess new and additional costs for the purpose of determining eligible covered costs. And I just want to note that this is one of the two models we have, and the other one will be discussed in the MRF cost webinar taking place on October 21st. Turning to a bit more detail on the covered cost assessment and the funding model, here's where everything comes together. You'll see this equation at the top. Each project submitted for funding will be compared to CAA's cost model to validate its eligibility. Covered costs generally include three elements: capital investments, operating costs, and reasonable profit margins. Adjustments are made for efficiencies and non-covered costs, such as the materials handled under other programs, in order to ensure fairness and accuracy in funding decisions. So if you look at the equation at the top, you'll see that the proposed project cost will subtract the associated efficiencies or non-covered cost allocations, add back the additional costs like incentives, marketing fees, and profit, which ultimately gives us the eligible covered cost. Next to the topic of service agreements and contracts, there will be two main types. One, there's going to be a general service agreement that covers all projects under a participant or an applicant. Two, there's going to be project-specific funding contracts. The general agreement includes requirements like, as you'll see here, insurance, labor standards, and compliance with environmental laws, among others. The project funding contract outlines performance reporting, payment terms, and accountability. This two-tiered approach simplifies participation while maintaining strict oversight on how funds are being used. So really, to clearly outline this, CAA will develop draft service agreements by applicant or entity and project contracts for each major project. The survey feedback that you provide after the webinars will be taken into account when developing those draft agreements or contracts, so please be as detailed as you can. Final draft of the agreements will be shared with applicants for their review, and once applicants receive them, they can review them with their legal counsel, city council, and other reviewers that they feel are needed to review. Project contract will be a separate agreement to the service agreement and will be specific to the project and also related to the actual funding. As we move beyond residential curbside programs, the next section will cover a little bit about commercial and multifamily recycling. Here, the cost modeling includes mixed route collection, front load container services, and cart systems for multifamily housing. I want to note here that roll-off collection is going to be analyzed separately from this. What is ensured here is that commercial and residential service providers are both supported under SB 54, with targeted funding to close service gaps and achieve full compliance across property types or sources of material. For rural and drop site programs, the goal is really simple. Expand curbside recycling wherever curbside trash is collected. This is really key to achieving equitable recycling access statewide. In these areas, funding will support things like new carts, vehicles, and the transfer capacity to handle added volumes. Because transportation distances are often greater in the rural areas, the PRO will cover transfer and holding costs to the nearest MRF. Drop site programs can also receive funding for infrastructure or handling costs where they are needed. Moving on to alternative collection. So on the alternative collection system side, CAA's goal is to work through existing service providers wherever possible. However, for certain materials, take back to retail and drop site options may be needed. These approaches will evolve over time as end market capacity expands and new technologies emerge. The focus here is to build flexible systems that ensure every covered material has a viable, responsible collection pathway. I'm going to switch gears now to the payment component of this presentation. We're going to discuss payment procedures here, and payments, really the question here is who is paid. And payments will be made directly to the project applicant, whether that's a jurisdiction, a JPA, or a private service provider. For publicly owned systems, funding flows directly to the local government or local jurisdiction. For privately operated systems, payments go directly to the company providing the service. This structure will ensure that there's clear accountability and simplified disbursement for all of the entities applying for funding. I just want to stop here for a second and acknowledge that we've heard concerns through our interactions with various industry players about a risk of double payments. What we're going to do here at CAA is we'll take steps to ensure that ratepayers are not paying twice for the same recycling services. Service providers will be required to document which costs are specifically related to SB 54 activities and are not already covered by local rates or other funding. CAA will also set clear rules for what counts as eligible costs versus costs already funded by ratepayers, and any overlapping payments, if they are identified, they will be adjusted. All parties involved in the funding will be notified of payments being issued, starting with the jurisdictions. If you look at the draft regulation, it states that for costs determined to be a recycling service provider's covered costs, the PRO or independent producer shall first notify the local jurisdiction on whose behalf a recycling service provider provides solid waste handling services of such determination. That means that the jurisdiction is going to get the first notice of the funding determination wherever the service provider is operating within that jurisdiction. These payments will also be reported as part of the CAA's regulatory requirements wherever they're required and applicable. And CAA will also conduct regular reviews and audits of claims and requests for reimbursement to ensure that SB 54 payments will only cover costs that are not otherwise paid through other means, such as franchise agreements or grants or similar vehicles. So how does payment work? Most projects will follow a reimbursement model, meaning payments are made after eligible costs are incurred. However, prepayment options will be available for rural, disadvantaged, or smaller private entities that need upfront capital. Capital costs will typically be paid in lump sums or in progress-based installments, while operating costs will be reimbursed per ton, mile, or trip. This tiered approach ensures both flexibility and fairness in funding distribution. Now that we talked about payment a bit, I'm going to move to public education and outreach. Public education and outreach are key components of SB 54 funding. CAA will provide consistent support for statewide campaigns as well as local outreach programs. Local jurisdictions may use funds to community-based efforts such as digital media, school partnerships, community events, and direct engagement with residents. These efforts ensure that Californians understand what's recyclable and how to participate, which is really a critical step for program success. Again, quick note here that CAA's California Education and Outreach webinar is on October 23rd, where a little bit more detail will be discussed. Moving on to some of the sample scenarios or example scenarios of funding. In this slide, we've provided some practical examples of how reimbursement might work. For instance, a jurisdiction shifting from an opt-in recycling program to universal service could have the net new cost covered. That new cost is the difference between the base and expanded programs. Similarly, if a drop site program transitions to curbside collection, costs for new trucks, carts, labor, and transport would all qualify as eligible covered costs. However, it's really important to note here that replacement equipment performing the same existing function will not be covered. Only new or expanded services tied to SB 54 compliance will be covered. Finally, as we wrap up, CAA is continuing to refine the funding process. We're finalizing our cost models, we're conducting additional data gathering interviews, and we are preparing the reimbursement chapter of the program plan. The key message here is that CAA will work directly with every applicant to ensure eligible covered costs are funded, and most importantly, that those costs cannot be passed along to customers or ratepayers. This maintains fairness while making sure that the ratepayers are protected. I know this is a lot of content to go through in one go, but I just want to reinforce here that as part of our process, we have listened to feedback from many interested parties, and we've aimed to address various aspects of that feedback over the last little while. So just to close this off, it's really important to note that SB 54 is about supporting the success of California's recycling system. What it does is it ensures a fair, transparent compensation for new and additional costs. It protects local agreements under statute, and the specific statute is PRC 40059B, and encourages continuous improvement in recycling without adding financial burden to residents or businesses. Together, through collaboration and data-driven planning, we can achieve the environmental goals of SB 54 while preserving the strong local systems that make California a national recycling leader. And with that, I'll pause here for the Q&A discussion. Thank you.
All right, Francis, will you kick off our Q&A, please? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. Yes, Igor, we've had a few questions rolling in for you. The first one is, will the service and project contracts be available to the public?
I'm going to pass that question over to Susan Robinson, who's been working on this part of the project. So Susan, go ahead.
Great. So the service agreements will be a single agreement with common language that will be very easily available for folks to see. In fact, as Igor pointed out, one service agreement per entity, those will be replicated for folks, anybody receiving funding will have probably pretty close to the same service agreement. There may be variations between collection and recycling facilities, but the same basic questions. And then the contracts will be unique. I think that's probably no different than a municipal contract would be now, where those are becoming increasingly public. Any confidential information will be probably handled separately, not included in the contract itself. But most of the information in both of those agreements will be publicly available, public information that I should not have anything that would be problematic for sharing, and we'll want to make sure that there's ample opportunity for transparency for many of those same things that Igor brought up in terms of making sure that there's no duplication of payment on behalf of the ratepayers.
Very good. We had another questions that they appreciate the scenarios that we've provided, but they're wondering, in a case where a community already has collection service, but they're simply adding materials to their program, how that might apply for funding and how that would work.
Yeah, and that's a great question. So if they already have a collection service and the materials are being added, and those materials are the result of SB 54, those materials the addition of those materials will be eligible for funding as long as it is a result of SB 54. So the process will be the same to apply for funding for that type of a project. The portal will open in early 2026, and those applications can be submitted for us to review.
And the one thing I'd add to that, I think it's interesting that funding may show up in different ways, because it may be that in many instances, that new funding is more around public education and outreach. There are very few changes that need to be made to the system itself. It could be that there are, if it's a high volume commodity, might be impacted at the collection level. And if it is something that requires equipment or different change in operations, that could show up the recycling facility level. So it could look different in different situations for each different type of material.
That's fair.
Very good. The presentation was primarily focused around reimbursement of costs that have occurred, whether new or additional. In more rural areas or smaller communities where financing might be difficult, has CAA considered any other option as far as providing advanced funding or different funding requirements rather than reimbursement?
And I think we did talk about that in one of our slides. For specific types of communities, whether they're rural or disadvantaged, we are going to consider some of the advanced payments or prepayments in order to ensure that the projects that those communities have are funded. So yes, we will be considering prepayment funding in situations that warrant it. Susan, do you want to add anything?
I don't think so. I think that really is the distinction. We'll probably have some delineation around who's eligible for different kinds of funding. There may be some applicants where reimbursement is more appropriate versus some that really need some support for the pre-funding in order to make a project work. And we'll be looking at those to make sure that the kind of appropriate choice is selected for the different applicants.
Good. Another question is, how will CAA prioritize collection funding?
Susan, do you want to take this one?
I'll start off and you can add to it.
Sure.
So there's going to be a couple of layers on this, and I think it will change over time. There'll be priorities for increasing more of making sure that folks are collecting what's required right now. And I think that's first and foremost by January 2027. Everything that's on the required list needs to be a priority to be funded. It's a requirement for the law. I think then we'll be looking at those priority materials that CAA is hoping to add. There's a list of them to be able to add for increased collection and increased volume. So it's important to remember there are some very specific goals that SB 54 lays out in terms of the percentages. Everything has to be recyclable and compostable. We want to make sure that that's a priority, as well as for plastics, there are certain volumes and certain percentages that need to be achieved. So CAA will have some priorities that they'll be certainly making sure to focus on and working with service providers to make sure that's available for residential and commercial customers to be able to recycle.
Okay, and next question is, will CAA develop a form or application for the service agreement versus project-based reimbursement?
I think that's a great question. And yes, there's going to be a master service agreement or whatever you want to call it. And there's going to be a project contract specifically. Again, master service agreements are very familiar in the industry to different industry players, and they cover general aspects of the relationship. And then the project contracts are going to be specific to the project, which are also going to outline the way the payments are going to be distributed for that specific project. Susan, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, the one thing I'm going to add about the master service agreements is we've been looking at them as they're developing in other states as well and contemplating what it looks like in California. I think you can expect those to reflect very similarly to municipal contracts here in California already. Probably no surprises there. It's really your environmental performance, you're paying, labor rates, making sure you're reporting, you're, following the laws of the state of California as well as the SB 54. So I don't think there'll be any major surprises in the master service agreement. And then those the project contracts are really your operating agreements. It's really how things work for that particular project. So it becomes the scope of work basically for that project. So one entity could have one master service agreement and 5 different project contracts, each one unique. And so they will be very unique compared to that umbrella service agreement. So I think at the end of the day, if you approach it similarly to how you would approach a municipal contract or franchise, you'll see many similarities in both of those documents.
I just want to remind some of the participants that we're getting a number of questions about funding for reuse, refill, education and outreach, and different things like that. And the topic today is primarily about collection, and that's why we're answering mostly questions related to that. There are other webinars coming up that will deal with those particular topics to probably address many of your questions there. One question was about the model. How is the net new cost calculated? The cost funding model doesn't take into account baseline costs. How do those two work together, or are they two separate things?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So the models are designed in order to determine what the baseline or existing cost is in 2022. And the reason why we're looking at 2022 is because of the fact that the funding for reimbursement is effective as of January 1st, 2023. What our consultants that have been working on data collection and modeling are also doing is they're through the survey, they are asking different jurisdictions and service providers in terms of what their planned net new and additional costs are going to be. And that feedback is going to be taken into account to understand what those net new and additional costs are going to be. And if there are applications and requests and submissions for new and additional costs that reflect the data that we have collected in the model, we are going to compare those. We're going to work with the applicant to understand, if there is a variance between the model and the cost that has been submitted, so that we can align and make sure that we are all on the same page when it comes to the actual reimbursement, which will follow once all of the costs are defined as eligible covered costs. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think as a follow-up to that, someone is asking whether the model will be updated on an annual basis or regular basis at all.
It's a great question. I think we're still debating in terms of what the frequency of updates will be. We might take an annual approach. We might take an approach where we update certain criteria every year, but the overall master model every 3 or 5 years. We're still working on determining what the best approach is for this specific situation, because the approach to covering net new and additional costs is very unique, I think, to every other jurisdiction. And we really want to make sure that the models provide the functionality that we have designed them for, and that we're using them in the right fashion.
Okay. Another question, this one about will the administrative time needed to submit reimbursement applications, like gathering and entering and managing the cost data, be reimbursable?
That's also a very good question. I think if the administrative time that was invested in efforts that are associated with SB 54 are potentially reimbursable activities. I think, again, just like anything else, these administrative costs will have to be assessed through the CAA process developed internally. But if there is clear evidence that SB 54 has driven those efforts on the administrative side, they will be considered for reimbursement. Susan, do you have anything to add to this?
No, nothing to add to that.
Okay.
The only thing I would add, Igor, is in preparation for when the program is launched, if people want to track that information, I think that would be super helpful when the application process starts, because that may be information that we would request or require.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Dave. Thank you. And I think, because the program is fundable as of January 1st, 2023, I would also suggest, track what you're doing right now that is related to SB 54. But if you can sort of go back and identify costs that will result of SB 54, those will potentially be also reimbursable, because we are looking at sort of two periods of reimbursement, the period of 2023 to 2026, which is the pre-program period, and then 27 and on, which is the period when the program starts and is operating.
We have one about franchises. Will local jurisdictions still make decisions about who gets awarded franchise agreements?
Great question. The regulation stipulates that franchise agreements are not to be affected. This is everything is funded through this process, the CAA process, that is over and above franchise agreements, that is new and additional as a result of SB 54. So franchise agreements are not part of this discussion at all.
Question about payments. How long will payments take from the date a reimbursement cost has been approved?
I think we will have to work on determining what exactly that is, but I think it's going to follow a standard process, that companies typically implement. Whether it's going to be net 30, net 45, or some other form of net payment. We'll have to sort of figure out what makes the most sense. What is the policy for CAA in California, and what works within the process in order to get the payment as soon as we can to the applicant that has been approved for that payment. So stay tuned. More detail will come, and some of these questions are going to be answered within the actual project contracts when the project is approved as an eligible covered cost.
And maybe what I could do is just add on to that a little bit, which is there's different kinds of payments as well. There are going to be per unit ongoing operating cost payments. So that will be a function of information entered into a portal that then will be logged and then will be reimbursed on a regular cadence. And that will be, I think, very much, as Igor's pointed out, based on net 30, net 60, whatever is the, appropriate financial agreement that is delineated in the contract, the project contract. Then I think there are other kinds of payments, which will be one, reimbursement looking backward for a fixed amount, or perhaps as a project is being implemented in a large new facility, for example, there may be payments paid over time based on agreed upon thresholds or timed thresholds. As the building, the equipment is ordered, it's in place, second payment, it's operating, etc. So I think you should expect to see not one size fits all, but something that's appropriate to the project itself, and within the payment terms appropriate to the applicant as well. Some applicants may need a different payment agreement than others, and I think that CA will endeavor to be flexible on those terms as well.
Another one here is about collection. So how will cities accommodate CAA's funding into the new collection contracts? Will the cost be incorporated into the rates in future contracts? I know it's a bit outside our scope.
I mean, I think that is the decision of the city in terms of how they're going to manage that. I think I'll just leave it at that.
Lots and lots of questions here. Let's just see. Yeah, so for additional materials like cartons, for example, and additional tonnage of existing materials resulting from more education and outreach, how will you handle the marginal costs of more tons, units, or volumes? For example, if trucks fills up faster or experience more wear and tear for additional tons, meeting the goals will result in a lot more collection of the very same items as well as new ones. Like you've tackled that question earlier about just adding new materials, and this sort of related here with the increase in other materials.
Yeah, and I think, if we're adding new materials, there are going to be different costs associated with that. Whether it's a capital cost or operating cost. And you know what? If the trucks get worn down faster, that is part of the depreciation, amortization that is going to be applied to the cost profile of the applicant, of the entity that is applying for funding. So, what's really important is that when the application is submitted for fundable costs, all of this detail is provided, because all of the aspects of the cost, regardless of what they are, will be considered for reimbursement.
And if I could add on to that too, I think we've had questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we've had questions about the use of the base cost versus project cost. And I think this is an excellent example that if you don't know what the base cost is, it's very hard to calculate what the difference is going to be when we have multiple parts of the system that are going to be impacted. So I think this is a great example of understanding what the cost is before you implement the program, and then understanding the tons and the cost for the different things that are going to change in the program to know what the net new and additional cost is going to look like. So, the work that's happening between modeling and actual cost will help inform this to make that can be, in some instances where you have multiple changes, a fairly complex analysis that needs to be done, and it's going to make it go much more smoothly when we have that information up front that we can compare and have a really good educated dialogue with the applicant to make sure that we're all in agreement with what those net new costs look like.
We have another question here. For rural areas without curbside recycling options and limited recycling infrastructure, how will your MRF and collection models incorporate those limitations when self-haul drop-off and community collectings are the more common options for diversion? So sounds like it's a drop-off or depot-oriented service community, and the collection model, does it account for those, I guess?
Yeah, and I think this question is like well tied to the examples that we've talked about a little bit earlier in this presentation. We do understand that there are variabilities in terms of the service that is provided in rural areas, and that scenarios like the one described are going to occur. That is why we have consultants engaged on this project in order to determine and define some of those edge case scenarios where the cost will potentially be higher because some of the standard approaches to collecting do not exist. We are working on incorporating that, especially for the rural areas that are facing this type of situation or scenario. And we will be building that in terms of the criteria into the model.
This is primarily the questions that are related to collection. We have some other questions, but they're more related to other types of projects like reuse and refill or education outreach. And we're probably best to leave those for those particular webinars that address them there.
Sounds good.
There is one question there's more education and outreach that may be applicable here. And it's, can you share some concrete examples of education outreach activities that could have been implemented between January 1st, 2023 and January 1st, 2027 that might be eligible for reimbursement under SB 54 and scenarios where they would not be eligible?
I think that's a great
Education outreach
question,
has been done in the interim.
yeah, and I think an example of that would be a simple maybe educational pamphlet educating residents about SB 54 and what's coming down the pike, or it could be potentially educational material that is bringing in educating residents about putting the CMC recyclable materials in the bin in areas or in jurisdictions where those materials are not completely or fully collected. So, those are the two basic examples. I'm sure there are, 10 others, but I see that we are at time now. So I will stop here and pass it over to Francis with me.
Thank you so much, Igor. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate your time and participation. The next step is to provide your feedback. Your feedback is very important in developing a robust and effective plan for achieving California's ambitious recycling and packaging waste reduction goals. Please complete the questionnaire using the link provided in the chat. You will also find a link to the questionnaire in an email following this webinar, or you can access the questionnaire by using the QR code on your screen. To do that, simply open the camera app or on your smartphone or tablet, point your camera at the QR code on the screen, and then tap the link that pops up. That will take you directly to the questionnaire. Please submit your responses by 11:59 p.m. Pacific time on November 16th. We look forward to receiving your input. And the next slide, please. You can stay up to date by following us on social media, visiting our website, or emailing us at info@circularaction.org. Thank you again for joining us today. Bye.
Thank you.